Elizabeth sat down at her computer, rubbing her eyes tiredly. The clock read 11:30 in the evening. As usual, Mark was working late, so she decided to check their joint accounts. Lately, the expenses seemed suspiciously high. She was especially concerned about the unexplained credit card charges at expensive restaurants where they had never been together. It must be some kind of bank error, Elizabeth thought as she turned on her husband's laptop. Mark always kept all his financial documents on his computer. The laptop screen glowed with a soft light. Instead of the usual online banking window, a messenger window appeared before her eyes. Elizabeth froze when she saw a message from a certain Anna. "Today was great, darling. I can't wait for our next meeting. Your hotel is the perfect place for us. I especially love the way you ordered strawberries with champagne for me." Elizabeth felt a cold sweat break out on her forehead. Her hands trembled. "No," she whispered. It couldn't be true. She scrolled up the emails. Hundreds of messages over the past months. Photos. Meeting plans. Her eyes caught on a date. It all started over a year ago. It was then that Mark started staying late at work more often than usual. "Honey, I have an important project," she remembered him saying. "Don't wait for me with dinner." In one of her messages, Anna wrote, "I love your new watch. Thank you for such a luxurious gift." Elizabeth remembered the day Mark said he had lost his old watch at the gym, but it turned out he hadn't. Suddenly, she heard the sound of a car pulling up to the house. Elizabeth quickly took a few screenshots of the conversation and sent them to her email. Then she closed all the windows and returned the laptop to its original position. From the living room, she heard the sound of a key in the lock. Elizabeth got up from the table, trying to control the trembling in her hands. Mark walked in, as elegant as ever in his expensive suit. He wore a faintly feminine perfume. "Hello, darling," he smiled broadly. "Sorry I'm late. An important meeting ran over." Elizabeth felt nausea rising in her throat. Important meeting. Now she knew what that meant. "I'm fine," she managed to answer, trying to make her voice sound normal. "Dinner is in the microwave." Mark came over and kissed her on the cheek. Elizabeth could barely keep herself from pulling away. "You're the best. What would I do without you?" "It looks like you've already found the answer to that question," Elizabeth thought, but she didn't say anything. "I'm tired," she said aloud. "I think I'm going to go to bed." "So early?" Mark was surprised. "You usually wait for me. By the way, I have a business trip to Boston next week, for 3 days. Elizabeth remembered the message she had just read. "I can't wait for our trip to Boston. 3 days of just the two of us." "I hope the trip will be successful," she said, feeling each word coming out with more difficulty. "My head hurts," she added, noticing her husband's worried look. "Besides, tomorrow is a big day at work." As she climbed the stairs to the bedroom, she could hear Mark heating up dinner. The dishes clinked in the kitchen as he took out his favorite plate. The one Elizabeth had given him for their 20th wedding anniversary. An ordinary evening, ordinary sounds. But now it all seemed fake, like a theater set. In the bathroom, Elizabeth looked at her reflection in the mirror for a long time. 53 years old, 28 years of marriage. The wrinkles around her eyes had become more noticeable lately. Was that why he was looking for a younger woman? All their photos together on the walls, traveling together, plans for retirement, the house on the coast they dreamed of. It was all a lie. She turned on the tap and washed her face with cold water. The thought of calling her best friend Margaret flashed through her mind, but she dismissed it. "Don't cry," she told herself mentally. "Just don't cry. It will make you weak, and you can't be weak. Not now." The sound of the TV was coming from the first floor. Mark was watching the evening news, as he had done every night for the past 28 years. Elizabeth pulled out her phone and opened the gallery. Their last photo together was of dinner with friends last week. She stared at her husband's face, looking for signs of his betrayal. How could she have been so blind? Now she remembered how he kept checking his phone during that dinner, how he left to call a colleague. "Honey." Mark's voice came from downstairs. "Are you sure you're okay?" Elizabeth took a deep breath. "Yes, everything is fine. I'm just tired. Good night." "Good night, darling. I have a meeting in the morning tomorrow, so I'll be going to bed soon too." darling. The word now sounded like a mockery. I wonder, Elizabeth thought, how many times a day does he say that word to her? Elizabeth went to bed, but she could not sleep. Fragments of the messages she had read kept replaying in her mind, forming a picture of her ruined life. She remembered their first meeting, their wedding, the birth of their daughter Catherine, who was now in college. How would she take it all? The thought of her daughter made her heart clench even more. But instead of despair, she felt something else being born inside, something cold and hard, like ice. A plan began to form in her head. Okay, she thought, looking into the darkness. If you want to play games, Mark, let's play, but by my rules. An hour later, she heard Mark coming up the stairs. She pretended to be asleep when he entered the bedroom. She felt the mattress bend under his weight. I heard a familiar sound. He was texting with someone on his phone. Enjoy it while you can, Elizabeth thought. Soon everything will change. The next morning, Elizabeth woke up before Mark did. She quietly went down to the kitchen and began to prepare breakfast, as she had done every day for the past 28 years. Coffee, toast, omelette, everything as usual. But today, every movement was a struggle. Good morning, honey, Mark came into the kitchen, tying his tie. How's your head feeling? Better, thanks, Elizabeth replied, setting a plate in front of him. You have a meeting at 9? Yes, with new investors. It might last until the evening. Of course, Elizabeth thought, especially if the investor wears silk blouses and likes strawberries with champagne. I left my laptop at home, Mark said as he finished his coffee. If they call from the office, send them the files from your desktop, okay? Elizabeth could barely keep from laughing. He was giving her the opportunity to dig deeper. Of course, dear, don't worry. When the door closed behind Mark, Elizabeth immediately sat down at her laptop. Now she could study all the correspondence in peace. Anna Wright, she read in her lover's profile. 32 years old, works in a marketing agency. The photo showed a young blonde with a flawless figure. Of course, Elizabeth thought, who would have doubted it? She began to methodically copy all the messages, photos, and meeting dates. She opened a new document and began writing down important details. They meet every Tuesday at the Ritz Hotel. Room number is always the same, 512. He bought her a watch for $4,000. They are planning a trip to Boston next week. They met at a charity event a year ago. Suddenly the doorbell rang. Elizabeth jumped and quickly closed her laptop. Margaret, her best friend, was standing on the doorstep. Hi, I was in the neighborhood and thought I'd drop by for coffee. Margaret. Elizabeth felt tears coming to her eyes. Her friend immediately noticed her condition. What's wrong? You look pale. Elizabeth hesitated. Should she tell or not? But she needed at least one person to confide in. Mark. She took a deep breath. Mark has a mistress. Margaret gasped. What? Are you sure? I found their correspondence. Last night. By accident. They went into the kitchen. Elizabeth turned on the coffee machine with shaking hands. She was 32, a beautiful blonde. They've been dating for a year. Oh my God, Margaret sat down at the table. What are you going to do? Elizabeth turned to her friend. Her eyes were dry. Not what he expects. I'm not going to throw a tantrum. I won't file for divorce. I won't make a scene. And then what? I'll destroy his life. Slowly, methodically, so that he doesn't even realize where the blow came from. Margaret looked at her friend carefully. Is that really what you want? 28 years, Elizabeth said quietly. I gave him 28 years of my life. I gave birth to a daughter. I supported his career, and he... Her voice trembled. He's not even ashamed. He takes her to restaurants where everyone knows us. So what's your plan? Elizabeth sat down across from her friend. I'm still gathering information. But I know that not everything is clean in his company. He often whispered on the phone about some special deals. Maybe there is something there that will interest the tax authorities. You realize that this is dangerous, right? What do I have to lose? Elizabeth smiled bitterly. My life has already been ruined. Now it's my turn. Margaret took her friend's hand. I'm with you. Whatever you decide. Thank you. Elizabeth squeezed her hand back. I'm going to need your help. And don't tell anyone yet, not even your husband. Of course. And Catherine? Will you tell her? Elizabeth shook her head. Not now. She's studying for her final exams. I don't want to distract her. After Margaret left, Elizabeth went back to her laptop. Now that the first shock had passed, she could think more clearly. The correspondence mentioned some documents that Mark was afraid to show his partners, about meetings with people he didn't want to put on the official calendar. This could be useful, she thought, opening the folder with her husband's work papers. It had been a week since Mark's affair had been revealed. Elizabeth learned to wear a mask of calm and continued to play the role of the perfect wife. She cooked breakfast, took an interest in his work, even remembered to buy him a new tie, everything as usual. This morning, as soon as the door closed behind Mark, she went straight up to his office. Now she had a clear goal, to find the documents he had mentioned in his correspondence with Anna. Today was a terrible meeting, he wrote to his mistress. If the partners had found out about those papers in my safe, everything would have been ruined. Elizabeth went to the safe, hidden behind the painting. She knew the code, the date of their wedding. How ironic, she thought, as she typed in the numbers. Inside were folders with documents, flash drives, and some contracts. Elizabeth began to methodically take pictures of everything on her phone. What do we have here? She whispered, opening the first folder. Oh, this is interesting. The documents showed double-entry bookkeeping in the company. Mark had been funneling money through shell companies to avoid taxes. The amounts were staggering. Suddenly her phone rang. Elizabeth flinched when she saw her husband's name on the screen. Yes, dear. Hi, honey. Listen, I forgot some important papers in the safe. Can you bring them over? Elizabeth's heart skipped a beat. Of course. Which ones? There's a blue folder labeled Project Alpha and... You know the code to the safe, right? Yes, of course I do. Our wedding date. Her voice didn't betray her excitement. Great. I'll be there in an hour. Elizabeth quickly photographed the rest of the documents and put everything back. She took out the blue folder last, but made copies of all the pages beforehand. A young secretary met her at Mark's office. Mrs. Taylor, Mr. Taylor is in a meeting, but he asked me to give him the documents. Thank you, but I'll wait for him in person, Elizabeth replied with a polite smile. 10 minutes later, Mark showed up. Darling, you are my savior. He kissed her on the cheek. Will you stay for lunch? No, I have a meeting with Margaret. Give her my regards. I wonder, Elizabeth thought as she left the office, if Anna knows that you still kiss your wife. Margaret was already waiting for her at the cafe. Well? Her friend asked as soon as Elizabeth sat down at the table. I found something interesting. Elizabeth took out her phone and showed the photos of the documents. It looks like my husband is not such an honest businessman. Margaret looked at the pictures. Oh my God, this is tax fraud, Elizabeth finished. For millions of dollars. And what are you going to do about it? Elizabeth sipped her coffee. Nothing yet. This is just the beginning. I need more information. Be careful, Margaret warned. These things can be dangerous. Do you know what's most interesting? Elizabeth smiled bitterly. In his correspondence with Anna, he complains that I spend too much on the household, and he buys her jewelry for tens of thousands. Suddenly her phone rang again. This time it was Catherine. Hi, Mom. How are you? Elizabeth felt her heart clench. I'm fine, sweetheart. How are your studies? I'm studying for my exams. Listen, I was thinking of coming up for the weekend. No, Elizabeth replied sharply, then added more softly, You should focus on your studies. You can come back later. After the call, Margaret looked at her friend carefully. You can't hide this forever. I know, but now is not the time. I have to get everything ready first. Back home, Elizabeth began to organize the evidence she had collected. She created a separate folder on her computer, protected by a password. She put everything there, photos of documents, screenshots of correspondence, dates, amounts, names. It's like putting together a puzzle, she thought. Each piece individually means nothing, but together they will create a picture that will destroy you, darling. In the evening, when Mark returned home, she greeted him with dinner and a smile. How was the meeting? Good, he replied, untying his tie. Thank you for bringing the documents. You're welcome, Elizabeth said, thinking of the copies of those very documents in her hiding place. You're welcome. During dinner, Elizabeth watched her husband. Mark was calm and relaxed, talking about work and plans for the next week. For 28 years, she'd believed every word he said. Now every phrase seemed like a lie. By the way, she said, pouring him wine, I saw the Ritz today. It's so luxurious. You've never taken me there. Mark froze for a moment, but quickly composed himself. Really? We can go there sometime. The 5th floor looks especially beautiful, Elizabeth continued in an innocent tone. These huge windows. The glass in Mark's hand shook slightly. How do you know about the 5th floor? Oh, I just heard from my friends, she smiled. Why, is there something special there? No, nothing. He hastily changed the subject. How is Catherine doing? But Elizabeth noticed how his eyes changed. He's touched, she thought. I wonder if he will call Anna today to warn her about what I said. The next morning, she deliberately left a magazine open on the table with an article about adultery. A horrible story, she said, when Mark stopped by the table. This woman discovered that her husband had been cheating on her for 20 years. Can you imagine? Mark choked on his coffee. Why do you read such things? I'm just wondering how people can live a double life. Elizabeth looked him straight in the eye. How can you look into the eyes of a person you betray every day? I have to go to work. Mark stood up in a hurry. Of course, darling. Don't forget about dinner with the Thompsons tonight. As the door closed behind him, Elizabeth pulled out her phone and dialed the restaurant's number. Good morning. I'd like to make a reservation for tonight, under the name of Taylor. I'm sorry, Mrs. Taylor, but your husband has already canceled today's reservation, half an hour ago. Oh? Elizabeth smiled. Thank you. 5 minutes later, she called Mrs. Thompson. Linda, it's Elizabeth. I'm afraid I have to cancel dinner tonight. Mark is not feeling well. Oh, I hope it's nothing serious. No, just tired from work. Mark called last night to say he'd be late at the office. Sorry, honey, an urgent meeting. Of course, Elizabeth replied. By the way, I canceled dinner with the Thompsons. I told them you weren't feeling well. The pause on the other end of the line was almost imperceptible. Thanks. You're always so thoughtful. You know, she continued, you've been so busy lately. Maybe you should take a vacation. Go away together. I'll think about it. After hanging up, Elizabeth imagined him typing a message to Anna, warning her of the danger. She opened her laptop and added a new note to her file. Canceled dinner with the Thompsons. Meeting with A, visibly nervous after talking about cheating. Late in the evening, when Mark finally returned, he smelled slightly of alcohol. Tough meeting? Elizabeth asked. Yes, a lot of problems with the new project. You know, she said, looking him in the eye, I've always admired your ability to solve problems, but sometimes the easiest solution is to admit your mistakes, before it's too late. Mark froze in place. What do you mean? Oh, just a general comment, Elizabeth smiled. By the way, I found your old watch. The one you lost last year. It was behind the closet in the bedroom. Mark's face paled noticeably. I'd better go to bed. Of course, dear. Good night. In the darkness of the bedroom, Elizabeth could hear his heart beating fast. He tossed and turned for a long time, unable to sleep. He picked up the phone several times, probably to write a message. Let him suffer, she thought. Let him feel what it's like to live in fear, to be afraid of every word, every look. This is just the beginning, darling. It's just the beginning. The next morning, Mark looked tired. There were dark circles under his eyes. He hadn't slept well. Maybe you should take a day off, Elizabeth asked him caringly. You look tired. No, I'm fine, as you say. By the way, I'm going to lunch with Margaret today, at that new restaurant near the Ritz. Mark stood up from the table. I have to go. Elizabeth looked after him and smiled. The game was starting, and she knew she would win this time. Elizabeth had been preparing for this meeting for a long time. She had studied everything she could find about Anna Wright, her workplace, her habits, her favorite cafes. And now it was time for a personal meeting. An elegant cafe in the city center was Anna's favorite lunch spot. Elizabeth was sitting at a table, watching the entrance. At exactly 1 o'clock, a young blonde woman in a silk blouse appeared. On her wrist glittered the same watch, a gift from Mark. "Miss Wright?" Elizabeth rose to meet her. "May I see you for a moment?" Anna looked at her in surprise. "Do we know each other?" "Not yet." Elizabeth smiled. "I'm Mrs. Taylor. I'm Mark's wife." Anna's face changed dramatically. She tried to back away, but Elizabeth gently took her hand. "Please, sit down. I won't make a scene." I don't know what you mean," Anna mumbled, but sat down at the table anyway. Elizabeth looked at her carefully. Young, beautiful, scared. "Nice watch," she said calmly. "Mark has great taste. You know, he gave me one just like it for our 20th anniversary." Anna instinctively covered her wrist with her hand. "Look, There's no need to justify yourself," Elizabeth interrupted her. "I know everything about you, about your meetings in Ritz, about your plans to go to Boston, about how you met at a charity event. He said you didn't know. Of course he did." Elizabeth sipped her coffee. "And what else did he tell you? That our marriage was long dead? That I don't understand him? That he was planning to divorce me?" Anna was silent, her eyes downcast. "Do you know how many people like you came before you?" Elizabeth continued. "Not a single one. For 28 years he was the perfect man. And then you came along. I didn't mean to—" "Oh, of course you didn't." Elizabeth took an envelope from her purse. "Take a look at this." The envelope contained bank statements. "See these transfers? The money he spent on you is money from tax fraud. He's hiding millions through shell companies." Anna flinched. "What? Did you really think that a mid-sized consulting firm could afford such gifts? A $4,000 watch, jewelry, hotels?" He said business was good. "He says a lot of things." Elizabeth smiled. "For example, did he tell you that last month he deposited $50,000 into another woman's account?" "What?" Anna looked up sharply. "What woman? Oh, you didn't know?" Elizabeth pulled out another document. "Here, take a look. Rachel Gordon. She works in his office. 5 years younger than you." It was a lie, but Elizabeth saw the blow hit its mark. Anna looked stunned. "I don't believe it. He couldn't." "Why not? He could deceive his wife. Why not deceive his mistress as well?" Anna took a glass of water with trembling hands. "Why are you telling me all this? Because a scandal will soon break out." Elizabeth leaned closer. "The tax authorities have already taken an interest in his operations. When it all comes out, everyone associated with him will suffer, including you." "Me? But You accepted gifts bought with dirty money. You've been vacationing in hotels paid for with fake accounts. How do you think this will look during the investigation?" Anna turned pale. What do you want from me?" Elizabeth stood up. "Just think carefully about whether he's worth it. And also—" She put her business card on the table. "If you have anything interesting to tell me about his financial transactions, give me a call. It might help you avoid problems in the future." On her way out of the cafe, Elizabeth turned around. "By the way, that hotel in Boston? He took Rachel there last month, the same room he promised you." She saw Anna take out her phone with shaking hands, barely holding back her tears. Getting into the car, Elizabeth dialed Margaret's number. "It's done." How did it go? "Better than I expected." She believed everything, especially about the other woman. But it's not true, is it? What does it matter? Elizabeth started the engine. The important thing is that she believed it, and now his life was going to be hell. In the evening, when Mark returned home, Elizabeth noticed that he was constantly checking his phone. He looked worried. "Is everything okay, dear?" she asked innocently. "You seem tense." Everything is fine." "Are you sure?" "You know, I had lunch downtown today. There's a really nice place downtown. Maybe we could go there together?" Mark stood up abruptly. "I have to work." "Run," Elizabeth thought, watching him go. "Run and try to explain everything, but this is only the beginning of your end." Over the next few days, Elizabeth watched as her plan began to take effect. Mark became even more nervous, constantly making phone calls and often locking himself in his office. One evening, she overheard a fragment of his conversation. "Listen, this is all nonsense." "No, I didn't lie to you." "What, Rachel? You believed some strange woman?" Elizabeth smiled as she laid out dinner. When Mark came downstairs, she noticed that his hands were shaking. "Rough day?" she asked him caringly. "Yes. Problems with partners." "Oh, I heard you on the phone. Something about a certain Rachel?" Mark dropped his fork. You were eavesdropping?" "Oh, no, honey, I was just passing by." "Who's Rachel?" "No one, just work stuff." The next morning, Elizabeth began the second part of her plan. She opened her laptop and began writing an anonymous letter. "Dear Mr. Davidson, as a shareholder of your company, I have to express my concern about the actions of the CFO, Mr. Taylor." She attached several scans of documents she'd found in Mark's safe, carefully removing any metadata that might indicate the source. "You're early today," Margaret said when Elizabeth arrived at her office. "I need your help with something. Can I send an email from your computer?" Margaret looked at her friend carefully. "Are you sure?" Margaret: "Absolutely. He has to pay for everything." An hour later, Mark's phone began to ring off the hook. Elizabeth could hear him shouting into the phone. "What documents? This is slander. Who sent this?" In the evening, he came home pale. "I have to go on a business trip. It's urgent. But you weren't supposed to fly to Boston until next week?" Mark shuddered. "Where did you—" Elizabeth looked at him with innocent eyes. "Did something happen?" "No. Just a change of plans." When he went to pack his suitcase, Elizabeth sent a message to an unfamiliar number. "He's on the run. It's time to act." The next day, articles about possible financial fraud in Mark's company appeared in all business publications. Anonymous sources provided documents that showed serious irregularities. Elizabeth was sitting in the kitchen, watching the news online when the phone rang. It was Catherine. "Mom, what's going on? My friends are calling me, asking about Dad." "Don't worry, honey," Elizabeth replied calmly. "It's just some misunderstanding at work, but they're talking about a criminal investigation. Your dad will sort it out," she said, feeling her heart clench at the lie. After talking to her daughter, Elizabeth took the last file out of the safe, the one she'd been saving for last resort. The documents that proved that Mark was not only tax evading, but also embezzling investors' money. "It's not time yet," she whispered, putting the folder back. "But soon." In the evening, Mark called. "Darling, I'm going to be late for a few more days." "Is it that serious?" she asked. "I saw the news. Don't believe everything they say. It's just a misunderstanding." "Of course, darling. By the way, the tax office called you. Something about an audit." There was a long pause on the other end. What did they say?" "They asked me to call you back. I wrote down the number." Okay. I'll take care of it." After hanging up, Elizabeth went to the window. It was starting to rain outside. She remembered how much she and Mark used to enjoy evenings like this, sitting at home, drinking wine, dreaming about the future. It was all a lie, she reminded herself. And now he's going to pay for it. She received a message from Anna on her phone. "I can tell you about his other frauds. When can we meet?" Elizabeth smiled. The plan worked perfectly. The mistress became the enemy, the partners started investigating, the tax authorities became interested in the documents. The ring around Mark was tightening. "You're playing with fire," Margaret said when they met the next day. "This could end badly. For whom?" Elizabeth sipped her coffee. "For him? It has to be. For you. If he finds out, he won't. I've thought of everything. Every step, every document. He won't even realize that I'm behind everything." At that moment, her phone vibrated. She received a message from Mark. "Honey, I need some documents from the safe. It's urgent." Elizabeth smiled. "See? He still trusts me completely. And this will be his last mistake." The law firm office was quiet and cool. Elizabeth was sitting across from an elegant middle-aged woman who was carefully studying documents. "Mr. Taylor is really in serious trouble," Patricia Williams said as she put the papers down. "And you say you have more evidence?" Elizabeth nodded. "More than you can imagine. But I need your help." Patricia wasn't just a lawyer. She was the ex-wife of Richard Davidson, Mark's main partner. Their divorce 2 years ago made a lot of noise. "Why did you come to me?" Patricia asked. "Because you know what it's like to have a man you trusted turn out to be a liar." Patricia's eyes flashed. "Richard? Mark helped him hide his assets during your divorce." Patricia sat up straight in her chair. "What?" Elizabeth pulled out another folder. "Here are the documents. Shell companies, offshore accounts. Everything was planned in advance." "Bastards," Patricia whispered as she looked through the papers. "That's why the court awarded me so little. Now do you understand why I'm here?" Patricia nodded slowly. "What do you want from me? Your connections, your experience, and your thirst for revenge." They talked for hours. Patricia knew all the company's weaknesses, all the secrets that had accumulated over the years. And most importantly, she knew who to tell and what to tell. "Tomorrow, I'm meeting with a representative of the tax service," Patricia said in the end. "An old friend of mine. I think he will be very interested in these documents." Elizabeth smiled. "Great, and I have a meeting with a financial journalist. You are a dangerous woman, Mrs. Taylor. So are you, Mrs. Williams." In the evening, Elizabeth received a call from Mark. "Honey, you won't believe what's happening. Someone sent documents to the tax office. It's complete nonsense." "Oh my God," she faked concern. "This is terrible. Maybe you need a lawyer? I've already hired the best one." "Okay." Elizabeth hid her smile. "By the way, Linda Thompson called today. She asked about you." "What?" Mark's voice grew tense. "What did she want?" "Nothing much. She just said she saw you at a restaurant last week, with some young woman." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. It was a business meeting." "Of course it was, dear. I told her so." The next morning, a new bomb went off. A leading business newspaper published an article about possible fraud in the company. Anonymous sources talked about money laundering schemes. "Have you seen this?" Patricia showed Elizabeth the newspaper during their meeting. "Richard tried to call me 3 times already. And what did you say?" "That I don't have time to talk to crooks." They were sitting in a small cafe, away from the business center. Patricia looked pleased. "The tax office is starting a full-scale audit. My friend says that he hasn't seen such dirt on them in a long time." "And what about Richard?" "Oh, he's in a panic. Looks like your husband wasn't the only one who was conducting questionable transactions." Elizabeth sipped her coffee. "You know what's funny? Mark still doesn't understand where the wind is coming from. Husbands often underestimate their wives." Patricia smiled bitterly. "This is their biggest mistake." In the evening, Catherine called. "Mom, what's going on? They're writing terrible things about Dad on the internet." "Don't believe everything they say, honey," Elizabeth replied, feeling a pang of guilt. "But his company. They say there's some kind of fraud there. Your father is a smart man. He'll figure it out." After hanging up the phone, Elizabeth looked at the photo of her daughter on the table for a long time. "I'm sorry," she thought. "But he started it." Late in the evening, she received a message from Patricia. "Get ready. It's going to be hot tomorrow." Elizabeth looked out the window. Clouds were gathering on the horizon. Perfect weather for a storm, she thought. The phone rang again. This time it was Mark. "Honey, I think I'm going to have to stay here for a few more days." "Is it that bad?" No, it's just bureaucracy. You know how it is." "Of course," she said sweetly. "By the way, you received some official correspondence. Something from the tax office." She heard him suck in a sharp breath. Don't open it. I'll deal with it myself when I get back." "Whatever you say, darling. Take care of yourself." Elizabeth put the phone down and smiled. There was no actual letter, but she knew he would not sleep that night. Early the next morning, Elizabeth sat in the office of her financial advisor, Mr. Brown. The elderly man was carefully studying the documents she had brought in. "Mrs. Taylor, what you're asking for. This is a big step," he said, taking off his glasses. "Are you sure about this?" "Absolutely," Elizabeth replied. "I want to transfer all my personal assets to the new accounts, and I need to do it today. But your husband—" "My husband is too busy saving his company from collapse right now," she smiled. "We have a joint prenuptial agreement. I have the right to dispose of my part of the property." Brown sighed. Good. Let's start with the shares that are in your name. Over the next few hours, they methodically transferred assets. Stocks, bonds, bank accounts, everything that belonged to Elizabeth personally came under her full control. That's it, Brown said in the end. Now your husband will not have access to these funds. Excellent. One more thing. Elizabeth pulled out a folder. I want you to look at these documents. It seems my husband has been making some transactions with our joint assets without my knowledge. Brown began to read, and his eyebrows went up. These are serious violations, Mrs. Taylor. I know. Do you think we can challenge this? With this evidence? Absolutely. On the way home, Elizabeth received a message from Patricia. The IRS is starting to seize the company's accounts. Richard is hysterical. She smiled and dialed Mark's number. Honey, I just got off the phone with a financial advisor. There seems to be something wrong with our accounts. What? Mark's voice was tense. What is it? I don't know. There are some strange transfers. Mr. Brown said it looks suspicious. Don't do anything, he almost shouted. I'll take care of it. But our savings, I said. Don't touch anything. He abruptly hung up the phone. Elizabeth looked at the phone and laughed softly. He didn't even realize it was too late. In the evening, Margaret called, Have you seen the news? Mark's company's stock fell by 40%. I have, Elizabeth replied calmly. And this is just the beginning. My God, you really did it. How are you feeling? I feel great. You know, I never thought revenge could be so sweet. The next day, she received a letter from her lawyer. All the documents are ready. As soon as the official investigation begins, we will be able to prove that you had nothing to do with your husband's financial fraud. Elizabeth opened the safe and took out the last folder, the one with evidence of Mark's most serious crimes. The time had come to use it. She called Patricia. I have something else. Documents proving money laundering through offshore accounts. Send them over. My friend at the tax office will be thrilled. In the evening, Mark called again. He sounded tired and scared. Honey, listen. We may have money problems soon. We'll have to save money. Oh, don't worry, Elizabeth replied sweetly. I have already taken care of my savings. What do you mean? Well, you know, I transferred them to separate accounts. Just to be safe. You did what? What's the big deal? She asked innocently. You've always told me to be careful with my finances. But how? When? Oh, Mr. Brown was a great help. By the way, he found a lot of interesting things in our joint accounts. It turns out you've been making transactions without my knowledge. That's a violation, isn't it? There was silence on the other end of the line. Mark? Are you still there? What are you up to? His voice was trembling. Aya? Nothing. Just looking out for my own interests. Just like you, darling. Just like you. After hanging up, Elizabeth poured herself a glass of wine and went to the window. The city lights flickered in the darkness. Somewhere there, in an expensive hotel, her husband is now realizing that the ground is slipping away from under his feet. This is for 28 years of marriage, she thought. For every lie, for every betrayal. Her phone vibrated. A message from Patricia. Tomorrow, everything will explode. Be prepared. Elizabeth smiled and raised her glass. To a new beginning. The morning newspapers were full of headlines. Large-scale fraud in a financial company. Mark Taylor under investigation. $1 million fraud uncovered. Elizabeth was leisurely browsing the news with a cup of coffee when the phone rang. Mom! Catherine's voice was trembling. What's going on? Dad's on TV. They say his company is... I know, honey, Elizabeth interrupted her gently. Come home. We need to talk. But Dad, that's what I want to talk to you about. An hour later, Catherine burst into the house, her eyes red with tears. Mom, it's not true, is it? Dad couldn't. Elizabeth hugged her daughter. Sit down, dear. There are things you need to know. What are they? Your father. Elizabeth took a deep breath. He's not who we thought he was. She pulled out a file. Look, all the evidence is here. Financial fraud, double-entry bookkeeping, money laundering. And there's more. Catherine flipped through the pages, her face growing paler and paler. But how? How did you know? By accident. The same way I found out about his mistress. What? Catherine jumped up. Dad, cheated on you? For over a year, Elizabeth answered calmly, with a young woman named Anna. Catherine fell into a chair, covering her face with her hands. Oh my God, what is going to happen now? At that moment, the doorbell rang. 2 men in suits stood on the threshold. Mrs. Taylor, Federal Bureau of Investigation. We need to talk to you about your husband's case. Elizabeth nodded calmly. Of course. Come on in. The agents settled into the living room. Catherine sat next to her mother, still in shock. Mrs. Taylor, one of the agents began. We have reason to believe that your husband was involved in large-scale financial fraud. Did you know anything about this? No, Elizabeth answered. But when I found the suspicious documents, I immediately contacted a lawyer. She pulled out another folder. Here are all the materials I collected. My lawyer has already sent copies to the IRS. The agents have reviewed the documents. This is very serious evidence, Mrs. Taylor. Do you realize that your husband is facing a long prison sentence? I do, she replied calmly. But the law is the law. After the agents left, Catherine turned to her mother. Did you plan this? Elizabeth looked her daughter in the eyes. I was protecting us, dear. Your father left me no choice. At that moment, her phone rang. Patricia, turn on the news, quick! The TV screen showed Mark being taken out of the hotel in handcuffs. His face was gray, his eyes were empty. Oh my God, Catherine whispered. Elizabeth stared at the screen in silence. The announcer said, Chief Financial Officer Mark Taylor has been arrested on charges of massive fraud. According to preliminary data, the amount of damage is... The phone rang again, this time from Margaret. Are you there? I can see it. Are you okay? Elizabeth looked at her daughter, who still couldn't look away from the screen. I'm fine. Everything is going according to plan. In the evening, a letter came from Mark's lawyer asking for a meeting. Elizabeth replied with a short refusal. What happens now? Catherine asked before going to bed. We will start a new life, Elizabeth replied, hugging her daughter, without lies and betrayal. Late at night, when Catherine fell asleep, Elizabeth sat in her study looking through old photographs. 28 years of marriage, thousands of shared moments. Everything turned out to be a lie. Her phone vibrated, a message from an unknown number. Are you happy? You have ruined my life. Elizabeth calmly replied, No, darling, you ruined it yourself. I just showed everyone the truth. A month had passed since Mark's arrest. The autumn wind was blowing leaves across the yard of now her house. Elizabeth sat in her office, reviewing the divorce papers. Patricia brought fresh coffee. All the documents are ready. Given the circumstances, the court will consider the case quickly. Thank you. Elizabeth signed the last sheet. How is Richard? He resigned yesterday. Patricia smiled. It seems our revenge was more extensive than we had planned. New details of the case kept coming out in the news. It turned out that the fraud had been going on for years. Many influential people were involved in the scheme. The company was falling apart before our eyes. The phone rang. It was Catherine. Mom, I just came from my dad. Elizabeth tensed up. How is he? Catherine. He looks terrible. He asked to see you. No. But Mom. Catherine. Elizabeth interrupted her gently. Your father has made his choice. Now he has to live with the consequences. After the call, Patricia looked at her friend carefully. Are you not sorry? Elizabeth went to the window. You know what's the strangest thing? I feel neither joy nor sadness, only relief. In the evening, Margaret arrived with a bottle of wine. To a new life? To the truth, Elizabeth replied, raising her glass. They sat in the living room, reminiscing about the past. All those years when Elizabeth believed in a perfect marriage, while her husband built an empire of lies. What are you going to do next? Margaret asked. I'm going to travel. You know, in all these years, I've never been alone in Paris. Mark always said it was a waste of money. And now I have enough money and freedom to do whatever I want. The next day, I received a letter from Mark's lawyer. My client is ready to agree to any terms. He asks only for one thing, not to testify against him. Elizabeth wrote a short reply. It's too late. The truth is already known to everyone. In the evening, she sat with Catherine in the garden. Do you know why I did it? Elizabeth asked. To take revenge? Not only. I wanted to show you an important thing. Never let anyone humiliate you, even if it's someone you love. Catherine hugged her mother. I'm proud of you, Mom. A week later, the first hearing in the divorce case took place. Mark attended under escort. He looked 10 years older. Elizabeth, he began as she walked by. She stopped, but didn't turn around. Yes, Mark? Why? Why are you doing this to me? Now she turned and looked him in the eye. You really don't understand? 28 years, Mark. I gave you 28 years of my life, and you ruined it all for a young mistress and dirty money. I loved you. No, she interrupted. You only loved yourself. The evening after the hearing, Elizabeth sat in her office, looking through old photo albums. Their wedding photo caught her eye. So happy, so young. She closed the album and went to the window. The city below was shining with lights. Tomorrow, she would fly to Paris. Then, perhaps, to Rome. Or to Barcelona. Now she could choose. Her phone vibrated. A message from Anna. Thank you for opening my eyes. You are a strong woman. Elizabeth smiled and deleted the message. The past was in the past. On the table was a ticket to Paris and a new passport in her maiden name. The beginning of a new life. To freedom, she whispered, raising her glass of wine. Somewhere in prison, her ex-husband was beginning to realize the cost of his betrayal. And she was finally free. Free from lies, from humiliation, from false happiness. Elizabeth turned on her favorite music and started packing her bags. Tomorrow her new life begins, a life in which she will never let anyone betray her again.